Hi, folks. This is Dean Curry for the Curry and Ice Show. Jeffrey Ice will be joining us for week 10 next week, but for week 9, it's just going to be me, Dean Curry. The Curry and Ice Show for Fantasy Football RSVP. That is the channel. Fantasy Football RSVP Waiver Wire Week 9. Well, I guess at this point, things are getting a little bit interesting. You may be in a position where you're leading your league, which is great, but it's generally not always the case. Many of you may actually be fighting to get into a playoff spot, or may actually be below a playoff spot, and you need to run off a series of wins. I'm going to tell you how to do that. There have been, I've never been one that, goes, 10-1 or 12-2 or like for the season. I'm always more around the middle of the pack because I'm always generally looking at the matchups that I need, and I think a little bit more long term. So I have been notorious for not doing so well in the beginning of the season, but towards the end of the season, especially the playoffs, I build my team more for the long term and for the playoffs. And, I have consistently, done well in leagues, winning them, lots of seconds. But before we get into the waiver wire, let me just explain something to you. Sometimes, in fantasy football, you could do everything right and still lose. Believe it or not, I have this crazy example. I have a friend. He plays fantasy football, 12-man PPR league every year. And there's been many years he won his league. And I hadn't seen him for a long time. And I just ran into him a few months ago. And I'm sorry, this was for last year's league. So I saw him a few months ago, but he told me the story last year towards the end of the NFL season. And he basically told me, I was like, how are you doing in your league? You winning it? He said, you will not believe that my points for is not bad, but I'm doing terrible. And I was like, well, how bad is terrible? You have a couple of wins. He said he was 0 wins and 12 losses, which never happened to him. He was so discouraged. And I basically was asking him about his league and, how he was losing. He was basically losing every week by 6 to 12 points, or like just the craziest scenario. And this guy is not only a great fantasy football player, but he's a smart guy, and he just got a run of bad luck. Some of the players he picked for good reasons, he thought would perform, didn't. And I know that's the most out there story, to have 0 wins and 12 losses. That's never happened to me, even if something, didn't go my way one year or something like that. But, I know the guy. He's smart. He's won his league against these guys before. And, I talk sports with him all the time. He really knows what he's doing, but he just had, some injuries. He had, a ton of bad luck. He had, I don't know how many close, victories where he lost by a handful of points. And his points for were not the worst in the league. They were actually, middle of the road, which means he should have been, more towards the middle of the road and in the playoff hunt. Because his points for were actually not bad. But, his points against were the highest in the league. And it just seemed that every time people played his team, they put up ridiculous amounts of points. I mean, the points against him, he was leading the league by far, by hundreds of points. So it does happen. The last number of weeks myself, I had a big, substantial lead in one of my leagues, and in all the other leagues, I'm winning. handily, but one of my leagues, some weird things happened, and I scored close to 130 points or more 4 weeks in a row and lost all 4 weeks, which is really rare for me. And thank God, I had a good start to the season. But you can't get down on yourself. And, I always like to, tell you the good of what I do and sometimes the not so good. And in fact, in 2 of those weeks, I lost by a handful of points, and it does happen. But again, my team, is notorious for not finishing first in the division. But I always come on strong at the end of the year and make strong moves. And even the last 4 weeks, I made some really good moves. If I had got up to 140 or 40-ish, I would have won 3 of those. But, it does happen. A couple of injuries, couple of, things didn't swing my way. But mostly the people I played were putting up ridiculous scores, like way over 170, 180, a couple of those weeks. So those things do happen. So, don't ever, feel you're necessarily doing anything wrong. Yes, you want to be humble. You always want to adjust. You don't want to fall in love with your players, but don't get down on yourself, because the very strategy you use that isn't working out for you this time could be the very strategy that works for you next time. And in the case like myself, I've used, similar strategy for a very long time, and 9 times out of 10, it works for me, big time. So let's go to the waiver wire. I just thought I would throw that in for week 9. At this point, finding players could be rather difficult, to say the least. You're dealing with, running backs that are sparse. There's always more wide receivers than running backs. Defenses are tricky. Kickers. A lot of people say kickers don't count, and it's just luck of the draw, and you just throw them in, and whatever happens, happens, or you find a kicker with a good offense. That's actually not really true with a great offense. And I'll explain that in a second, last. But let's first start off with top of the draw quarterbacks. Actually, let's save quarterbacks, because at this point, a lot of people have the quarterbacks they need. Let's save that for a little later. Let's get right into it with running backs, because running backs are very sparse at this point. Every team that uses a platoon system like the Eagles with Smallwood and Clement, it's like, which guy is going to, and now they have a third guy coming in, since Ajayi went down. It's like, what guy, do I play? Same thing with Baltimore. Sometimes it's Allen, sometimes it's Collins. Forget the New York. I'm a New Yorker, so forget the Jets, because you don't know. Again, when Bilal Powell was in there, he's now on IR. It was hard to figure out, is it going to be him or Crowell or, but for the most part, if you're playing in an 8-person league or 10-person league, there may be some running backs. But if you playing in a 12-person league, which a lot of people do, and I gear my comments towards that. So a lot of times when I'm giving you advice on players, you might say, oh, there's better players in the waiver wire than that. And you're probably right, but you're probably playing in an 8-man, league. Or your bench is only 6 or 7 players. But when you play in a 12-man league and you have 7 or 8 spots on a bench, it can be very difficult to find players at this point of the season. And some people don't even try. But again, don't get down on yourself, because you always want to try. Never give up. I mean, I've seen, players start their season 0 wins and 5 losses or 6 losses, and then win like the last 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 7, at the end. And you never know how things are going to fall. So you should just always, try your best. And you never know when you can make a late stage comeback. And that's what we're going to start talking about from weeks 9 on, is how to do that. Okay, so let's start with running backs. There aren't, a ton out there. Let's look at Jalen Richard. Now, I am not a big fan of playing the Raiders. I actually do like Gruden. I think he's a terrific coach, and I think he's doing everything he needs to do right now in Oakland, which is basically start over. And I think it's a smart move, and I know a lot of people think I'm crazy. Oh, you give up Mack and you give up, your best players, Cooper. But, the Raiders are a mess, and they've been a mess for a very long time. And part of the reason why they're a mess is they keep trying to put Band-Aids on their situation, and, in hopes that, will turn around. And really what the team needs is a complete makeover. And Gruden knows that. Even though he's getting bashed in the, media, nobody knows what they're talking about. This guy's a Super Bowl champion. He also took another team almost to the Super Bowl with the Raiders, and he took Tampa Bay there as well, and then the Raiders were right there because of the team he built. Guy knows what he's doing. I've seen him on TV. He's excellent, smart mind. And if I were him, I'd be doing the same thing. I'd unload all of our great players for draft picks, try to get younger, try to get faster, and get a lot of young guys and build around a really, young core. And Mack is a great player. He's not old, nor is Cooper, but, they're players that are demanding big contracts now because they've been in the league for several years. And, they can't really, it's hard to do that when you're trying to rebuild your team, to pay a huge salary, and you need those draft picks, and they're stepping in the right direction. Marshawn Lynch is on IR. Okay. I wasn't a fan of his anyway. I was when he played for the Seahawks, beast mode, but he hasn't been that for a long time. Some people are talking about playing Martin, their running back. I've always been one of those people that says, you don't want to play Doug Martin. I've been burnt so many times on that guy. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, he did have almost 80 yards and stuff like that. I mean, I would not, if you're desperate, maybe consider him, but I wouldn't highly recommend it. But Jalen Richard, a lot of weeks I've been looking at this guy, and he has 7 or 8 catches for 50, 60, 70 yards, and it's every week. And you throw a touchdown or 2 in there, and now that, Cooper's out and Nelson's not even being used, and, you got to know John Gruden. He likes that, ground attack. He likes that, dump off to the, to the running back. He likes that balanced approach to the game where you're running the ball, you're dumping it off to the running back, you're throwing to your tight end, you're throwing to your receivers. He likes that balanced attack. He's old school. And this guy, Jalen Richard, although I wasn't sold on him for many weeks, I keep watching him, and I'm like, this guy's putting up double-digit points every single week. Last week, I don't know, he had 8 or 9 targets for a running back. That's just and that's pretty routine for this guy. And when you're in a 12-person league, or, you don't have many options, and you could sneak this guy in, and he's got a couple of favorable matchups coming up. And I'll just make sure in the advice I'm giving, I'm not necessarily giving you advice on taking players that are on a bye week, because this is week 9. However, there are times to go after a player in a bye week, and stash them. And we'll talk about that. But for now, you may be desperate for a win, like we all are, in some of our leagues at least. And he could be a very good play. Another very good play, I think, is Peyton Barber. Now, before you all jump out of your seat, The Peyton Barber, Ronald Jones back and forth has been dismal, and Peyton Barber has been dismal as well, except for last week. He put up, about 100 yards, plus combined, and he looked actually really good. Now, you have to factor in, the Bucs running game hasn't been that great, but that was under Jameis Winston. And he just has, an ability to throw picks, obviously, but he just, that type of quarterback that comes in and is a runner and, does a lot of dink and dunk passes and doesn't stretch the field and tries to run a very controlled type of offense. Well, let me tell you what that does. That basically brings the defense in, okay? And the defense comes in because there's not really a long threat, and they come in closer, and that actually affects the running game, But when you have, Fitzpatrick, come in and start winging the ball all over the place like he did last game in week 8, where I was actually watching that game, and it was like, no, it wasn't just the picks that Jameis Winston was throwing. The team was just stagnant. Evans is not even there. Deshaun Jackson disappears. But as soon as you put, Fitzmagic in, Deshaun Jackson, who's like demanding to be traded, all of a sudden becomes like a superstar. And Evans becomes an even bigger superstar. It was almost like Evans was sleeping during that game until Fitzmagic came in. But it wasn't just that, Fitzmagic, that's what I like calling him, so I'm just going to call him that. It wasn't like he was throwing short passes to these guys and working down the field. He was stretching the field with long passes. And he wasn't just stretching the field with like bombs. He was stretching the fields on the sidelines. I mean, he was like gunning it for jump balls on the sidelines, and those jump balls, that attracts a safety, that attracts a corner, when you loft it up there, and all of a sudden, the safeties, can't move in, and they can't, get in close, until, close to the line, and that affects the running game, and having Fitzmagic in there, people are like, oh, but Jameis Winston runs a lot, and then, yeah, but the defense is closing down in on them. And you know what? A lot of times Barber doesn't have a good game because Winston wants to run, and he wants to pick up yards. And it doesn't allow the running backs to get into a system. And, when quarterbacks run also, it just kills the offense. Quarterbacks shouldn't be run. I've been saying this for years when, Tim Tebow, who, I love what he does, charity and stuff like that. And, all these RG3 and all these running quarterbacks were coming into the league, and they had success at first. And I told everyone, this isn't going to last. This isn't going to last. They're going to learn how to play against these people. You have to be a pocket passer. Even Russell Wilson is running less and less, because he's gotten injured. He doesn't really run. He basically runs to pass. He moves around in the pocket, and he's always looking to pass. A quarterback, that runs, I think, too much is Dak Prescott. He still runs way too much, and what that does is it kills the offense. It's basically like a ball hog in basketball that's just dribbling, and you're just standing there. And he doesn't pass it to you, and then when he does pass it to you, you miss the shot in basketball. It's the same thing. When he runs around so much, Winston, he doesn't allow Barber to get into a groove. And these days, running backs need to get 20 carries, or at least 15, to get in some type of rhythm. They've all been saying that for forever. And, teams still, like the Eagles, want to do platoon. And, I'm not going to fault them because they won the Super Bowl, and all that. But the bottom line, they also had a great defense and receivers and phenomenal other situations, and it just fell their way. But normally, how many people win Super Bowls with platoons. And you really can't say the Patriots do, because those Patriot running backs have really defined roles. Like White has a defined role, Michelle has a defined role, and they use them. And, they don't, when they a lot of times they have a steady running back when they've won the Super Bowl, like a pound back, like Blunt, when they've won, and now Michelle. But anyway, Peyton Barber, when you put a Fitzmagic in there, he stretches the sidelines, he stretches the field, and these corners and safeties and the whole secondary and even the linebackers got to drop back into coverage. They can't inch up on that line. And mostly when you're passing the ball and you're handing the ball off, because Fitzmagic isn't gonna run, it basically gets the running back involved. They get excited. That's why when Fitzmagic gets in there, the wide receivers, it almost looks like they got an energy pill, and they're so excited because they know they're going to get the ball thrown to them, down, and Fitzmagic is going to get rid of it and not take the sack and not try to run and let his players play, and I couldn't believe that game. As soon as he went in, I was like, here we go again, just like the beginning of the season. And, I don't like to call any coaches inept or stuff. I know why they put, Jameis Winston back in. He was the franchise quarterback, and the general manager brought him there, and he's on all their commercials, but they pulled the plug on Fitzmagic way too soon. I know this guy sometimes has a tendency to, screw up. But, even in the game that he played poorly in, he had a huge comeback and almost won that game against the Steelers. And two of those 3 or 4 interceptions in the first half of that game were not his fault. Really were not his fault. It bounced off a guy and stuff like that. But he came up huge, and then he starts off a half in the fourth game, and he's not, playing that great, and they pull him, and I couldn't believe it, and I understand you have to give this Winston a shot because you built your franchise around him, but, you got to play, Fitzmagic. It's going to help the running game. Ronald Jones, they're saying, might be out several weeks now. So this guy can win you some weeks. He catches the ball, he runs the ball. I think it's a huge, huge play. Other plays, if Deontay Foreman is still available, even though Lamar Miller is playing better, they're just itching to get Foreman back in there because he does so much. Just be careful there. Don't play Foreman until he's in the lineup and he's producing. A lot of people lose weeks because they want to believe someone's going to come in. I'm notorious for never playing a player until he's proven himself 1 week. And I would rather be, a week too late than a week too early, because a week too early can actually get you a loss. A week too late, you put him in, oh, he's doing well. I see so many people, even when people come off injury, like Hilton, oh, I'm putting Hilton in right away, and I think his first week back, last week, 2 weeks ago, he had 2 touchdowns. But I was like, but the guy had 2 touchdowns, but he wasn't that involved. He didn't have targets. He didn't have receptions. He just had 2 touchdowns. But people pay, attention to that. And then last week, in a favorable matchup, he puts up nothing. He puts up a couple catches, or for a few yards. And, people are like, oh, he must be injured. Well, you want to wait until someone's really producing before you just throw them back into the lineup. But Deontay Foreman, another good play, I mentioned it last week, is Ito Smith. The guy puts up 8, 7, 9 fantasy points every single week. It may not seem like a lot, but here's what I want you to monitor about him. You might want to get him on your team before it's too late, because Freeman's out on injured reserve. He's done, at least until the playoffs. So he's done for the rest of the fantasy season. And then Coleman is in a contract year. He's on a 4-year contract that ends this year. They're not going to re-sign him. They're going to stick with Freeman, and they're going to want to see if they can let go of Coleman. He's going to test the market and demand money, and the Falcons aren't going to pay him. And as the season progresses, and I spoke about this in my last video for Waiver Wire 8, so I won't go into a long thing about it, but he's available on a lot of waiver wires, and you might want to consider him picking him up, because they're going to get rid of Coleman, they're going to stick with Freeman, and they want to make sure that they have a reliable backup, especially with Freeman getting hurt. And the Falcons are 2 wins and 4 losses. There's a good chance that if they lose a few more games, they're going to be out of it. And they're not going to make a playoff spot, especially in the West. It's going to be very, very hard. And as they start playing more and more meaningless games towards the end of the season, they're going to want to see what they have in this guy, Ito Smith. They're not going to play. They're going to showcase him and say, what do we have with this guy? Let's see. Coleman, is going to leave anyway. We're not going to play him. And, this guy might be very valuable, as the year goes on. So any other running backs? I don't know. If Aaron Jones is still available, I doubt he is. Certainly, pick him up. I had him on my team. Let him go. I'll probably pick him up again, because now I never played him, but he's starting to be used. And I wanted to keep him stashed on my bench, but I didn't really have room, and I was forced to put him on waiver wire, but I'll probably pick him back up because no one picked him up, but now they're starting to use him. So, and they're seeing that the guy is dynamic, and I think they're going to start using him more and more. But again, be careful there, because with the Packers and their running backs, it's hard to judge what McCarthy is going to do with that team. But, at some point, I do think that quarterbacks and players have influence on what a coach decides to do. And I could just tell that Aaron Rodgers loves, Aaron Jones. Not because he has the same first name. He loves Aaron Jones, and he feels he's dynamic. And I could see him getting excited and saying, Coach, come on, you got to play this guy. And, he does, and he's doing more and more. So it's something you want to consider. Okay, so let's run to wide receivers. That's enough for running backs for week 9. One of my top prospects is Courtland Sutton on the Denver Broncos. You might want to consider doing that, because Courtland Sutton, Demaryius Thomas, it's Monday night. He may actually get traded. He actually tweeted today that he might get traded tonight, and he's going to be gone anyway, at the end of the season. And, Denver's not going anywhere again, meaningless games, and they're going to want to see what this guy, and he's dynamic, they have in Courtland Sutton. They really want, and, if Demaryius Thomas gets traded, which is a good chance it might happen, even if it doesn't happen, keep this guy in the team, because they're going to want to see as the season goes on more and more. And I could see that in games that they're trying to see more and more what this, kid's got. And he's really electric, especially on jump balls. Sanders actually got a little injured last game. He came back into the game, but he's a little banged up. So this I think could be a great play. Would I play him? No, I wouldn't play him until Demaryius Thomas is traded, or perhaps if they start showcasing him more. And again, you don't want to be a week too early. You'd rather be a week too late. Another star receiver that you might want to consider, and I know some of these I say and you're like, oh, not that guy, but just hear what I have to say before you judge, because a lot of these people I'm mentioning are people I rolled my eyes about. But in fantasy football, sometimes these players make a comeback, and sometimes their value increases, or they weren't used correctly, with a team, which may have been their fault too. just for the way they acted. Again, just hear me out before you respond. In the case of like Devontae Parker, I watched him last game. He looked really good. I mean, he put up like 150 yards, and I know one of them was on a tip, play that he got. But what people don't understand, he was wide open on another play. I actually watched the game, and it was like a long, like down and out, 30 yards on the sideline, and Osweiler completely overthrew him. That was at least a 30-yard pass, and or more. He probably would have ran out of bounds because he was headed that way, but he was wide open. And even at one point, he just stopped and looked at, the quarterback, like, what are you doing? I mean, and then there was another play, a walk-in touchdown that Osweiler completely overthrew him. And it would have gone for like another 60, 50, whatever yards and a touchdown. And he was wide. I mean, there was no one near him. And he completely overthrew him. And so, I mean, this guy could have put up over 200. And, I was watching him in the warm-ups, and something just clicked when I was watching him in the warm-ups. And I was like, wow, this guy looks really good. And they were just throwing him the ball in warm-ups, but he just had a look in his eye. I was like, he's going to have a big game. And just by looking at him, it's like, and I know he's not being used correctly there. They're not even throwing him the ball. They're showcasing Wilson and Brett and Amendola and all these guys. And, he's in the doghouse on that team, which may be partly his fault. But this guy could be traded, on trade deadlines coming up Tuesday night. He could easily be traded. And even if he's not traded, they may showcase him more because he can't hide from the fact. I mean, the guy looked like the best player outside of Hopkins, looked like the best player on the field. I mean, he had Osweiler throwing him the ball. Tannehill coming back, and the wide receivers on Miami are pretty banged up. And even he said after the game, I know I could play this game at a very high level, and you might want to consider picking him up. He could help you big time. Speaking of that game, the Texans, you might want to look at QT, Cutie, I guess it's pronounced that way, on the Texans, because the reason why is QT is really good. He may not play in week 9. I'm not sure, but you may want to consider picking him up anyway because they don't have a receiver unless they get one in a trade, and they may rest him this week, but he may prove to fill in for Fuller because Fuller's on injured reserve. And these are the type of trades you really want to consider making because they really like to use their 2 receivers. You may also want to look at Ryan Grant. He's not healthy yet for the Colts. Chester Rogers, I thought they were going to use more, and then they didn't use him, and it's hard to predict. Andrew Luck is just really loyal to the people that he trusts, and he trusts this Ryan Grant, who's coming back from injury. Again, you might want to, if you want to stash, put him on your team and wait till he starts producing because Rodgers had a terrible game last game. He wasn't even targeted except for like a 2-point conversion or something like that. There's other players you may want to look at if you're desperate. Maybe DJ Moore on Carolina. I'm a big believer that in fantasy football, the only person you play on Carolina is their running back and their quarterback. And when I guess Olsen is healthy, because trying to figure out who, again, a running quarterback who gets injured a lot, Cam Newton, trying to figure out, who this guy is going to throw to from week to week. I mean, this DJ Moore is pretty electric, but it's because, Torrey Smith was out. And when Torrey Smith comes back, he may not come back this week, so if you need a quick plug-in, you may want to consider DJ Moore, but I would do it at your own risk. Um, I think that's pretty good. I wrote some of these down. Um, Sutton and Parker, I guess, are my main. Let's move to tight ends. If Jack Doyle is available, please, please, please pick him up. I know Ebron is taking up snaps, but I'm telling you, Andrew Luck loves throwing to the sky like he did last week. He had a huge week, and it's his first week back. And if this guy, he may not be available on your waiver wire, but if he is available, he's just a reception machine, and he's a touchdown machine. And Andrew Luck loves throwing to this guy. And, everyone knows Andrew Luck loves his tight ends his whole career. But if he's available, pick him up, and don't worry about the timeshare because he likes throwing to both of them a lot. And he likes doing that whole spread the, wealth on that team. So you might want to consider picking up Jack Doyle. If Austin Hooper is still available, I don't know if he is. He is in some of my leagues. Am I crazy about that pick? No, I'm crazy about Jack Doyle. I'm not crazy about Austin Hooper, but at this point, things are getting a little tight I know a lot of people that had Njoku who put up a goose egg last week for Cleveland, and Jimmy Graham, who I have on one of my teams, put up a 1, but I never liked playing him, and I'm going to pick up Jack Doyle because he's a good pick. But if Austin Hooper, if you just need a guy who could get you 6 to 8 points and not put up a goose egg, he's probably, don't hold me to it, but he's probably got a decent shot at giving you, anywhere from 6 to 10 points, and he does occasionally catch a touchdown. Watson could be another small play if you're desperate, although I'm not a big fan of Watson on the Saints because they have Hill, and it's like playing Russian roulette. You never know what Drew Brees is going to do. But another player you might want to look at is Jordan Thomas. He's probably one of my more favorite picks of the week because he plays for the Texans. He's only 22 years old, but this guy is built like an offensive lineman. He's almost 300 pounds. He runs a 4.6, a 4.7 40, which for a guy that big tight end is actually really good. The guy's incredibly athletic, and again, I watched the Texan game. I didn't know this guy all that well because Griffin is usually their starter, and Griffin's he was ill. He had an illness, but the Texans might want to see what they got in this guy because Griffin really isn't doing much, and this guy picked up 2 touchdowns, and he looked incredible. He didn't have a lot of yards, nor a ton of receptions, but he had a handful of both, and he had 2 touchdowns. And with Will Fuller going down, and QT banged up, I don't even know who the next guy up is. I think his name's Vincent Smith or something for their team. Doing some research on him. I'll get back to you more with that. But they're running out of receivers. And this guy had a really good game, and he was wide open. It really caught me by surprise when I watched the game. So he's a guy that you may not necessarily want to play, but you may want to put him on your team or your bench and just see if they start using this guy. And if they do, you might want to consider playing him. Those are some deep dives. Let's see, what else do we have? Defenses. Defenses get a little hard because a lot of people have their defenses already. I know I picked Dallas as a potential defense. You might want to consider Dallas as a potential. They're going up against Tennessee in Dallas, and Tennessee is just a mess right now. And Dallas's defense is really been playing well, especially at home. I mean, including Dak. I mean, they're a great home team. Not as good away, but now they have Amari Cooper, which will allow Dallas. To basically people are like, oh, you have Zeke Elliott's having a horrible year. I said, well, don't forget, he had some hard matchups. Their whole offensive line was injured the first 4 or 5 games of the season, and they're slowly trickling back in. I think they just fired their offensive line coach too, which I'm not so sure was a great idea, but because they had a lot of guys injured, but maybe they needed to shake things up. But a lot of their offensive line is getting healthy, and now they have a guy who could stretch the field. What people don't realize about Des Bryant is he stretched the field so much because he was constantly. I mean, he was rarely single teamed. He was like always double teamed. So he stretched the field and was double teamed, and people had to pay attention to this guy, that it just opened things up on the offense. Now they're just loading the box against, Zeke, and they also know that Dak is going to run it half the time. So they're just loading the box. And, if Dak could start stretching the field with Amari Cooper, even if he doesn't, connect with him, just having him on your team will attract attention, and throwing to him once in a while, whether you connect, it will stretch the field, and it will open things up. And their offensive line is getting healthier, and they're getting some favorable matchups coming up. Zeke, could really open, things up. And the reason why I'm mentioning that to you is, you're probably wondering why, is when Dallas can control, they're a ball control offense, and they eat up a lot of clock. They don't score quickly like, certain teams. They love eating up 8, 9, 10 minutes. And what that does is it really rests the defense. And since we're talking about the defense here, it could be a sneaky play this week to play Dallas's defense at home against Tennessee. There's not many other picks for defense other than teams you already have, so I don't really want to talk about the Bears against Buffalo and stuff, because they're not available on waiver wire. But you might want to consider, and I know again this sounds crazy, so don't respond until you hear me out, is you might want to consider actually picking up the New York Jets defense for a couple of reasons. The Jets defense is underrated. It's actually pretty good, especially their secondary. And it's at times decent, even against the run, at times, depending on if their guys aren't injured. But here's the reason why you might want to consider the New York Jets. They're playing Miami, and Miami might lose a couple of players in a trade. They're injured, they're banged up. Is it Brock Osweiler? Is it Tannehill whenever he comes back? They don't even know how to use their running backs, whether it's Drake or Gore. They don't know what wide receivers. They had a wide receiver, Parker, who was inactive, for many weeks, and he puts up 150 and looked phenomenal. So they're a little all over the place right now, and the coach is getting a lot of pressure on them. And the Jets not only play Miami. The only thing I don't terribly like about it is they're playing in Miami, and Miami has a way of playing well at home. But the Jets play Buffalo the following week, and you might be able to get a couple of weeks out of the New York Jets. And again, they are underrated. And a lot of the reason why their defense isn't better is because their offense is been banged up with wide receivers, and they have a rookie quarterback who I really like. And they're banged up with their running backs. So they're not controlling the offense that much. And that only puts more pressure on their defense to be on the field longer. So if you really, I'd play Dallas first. If you're desperate, the Jets may be a sneaky play, not only this week, but next week as well. As far as quarterbacks, if Dak Prescott is available, I've never been crazy about him in fantasy, but if you're desperate for a quarterback, he has been known to put up big numbers, especially they're getting healthier. But it's not really my favorite pick, I don't think. people are talking about Fitzmagic. You might want to look at his schedule. I'm sure he's going to do well and put up points, but he has some ridiculous defenses that he's about to go up against, like several weeks worth. Like 4 or 5 weeks, he's going up against a really tough defense like Carolina, and like just defenses that are really, really hard. And you might want to look at that before you pick him up. You could always pick him up and try to trade him, which would even be smarter. But he has some really, really, I mean, I like the guy. He has some really tough matchups coming up, going against some really tough defenses. Believe it or not, in a lot of my leagues, Mitch Trubisky is still available, which is a crime. He actually has some really favorable matchups coming up, and he's just getting better and better. And that team, was really banged up with their wide receivers, and their wide receivers are getting healthier and healthier. And that defense with the Jordan Howard and Tariq Cohen, and even getting the tight end going, they're really starting to get healthy on offense, and they're getting healthier on defense if Mac can be himself again. But they have some really favorable matchups coming up, and Trubisky could be a really sneaky play to have. I would seriously consider playing that. So we have our running backs, we have our wide receivers. We went over tight ends. We went over quarterbacks, defenses. Now, we'll make this brief about kickers, because people think they're irrelevant. They're not. I consistently outperform people on kickers. Do I stream? Sometimes. But the main thing about a kicker is you want to find a team that has a pretty good offense, but not a great offense. A team that has a great offense, great running game, great balanced attack, but they have problems getting into the end zone. Okay, their red zone offense is actually pretty bad, which leads to more field goals. And you want that team to have a good defense, because you want to get a lot of opportunities. So let me say that again slowly. You want a team that has a kicker, and that team has a good balanced offense. They have problems getting into the end zone, a la wide receivers or whatever. And they also have a good defense, which means they get lots of opportunities to score. And you want a reliable kicker. And you want that kicker to also sometimes be going up against teams that have a really good red zone defense, which means they're really good at keeping people out of the end zone. And you also want, teams that have overall a bad defense. You want your kicker going up against bad defenses, but not awful defense. Maybe they don't have a good red zone defense, but their defense is actually pretty decent. I actually located a kicker that from now, week 9, until week 16 or 17, is actually going against 5 of the top 10 red zone defenses, which is perfect. And 4 of them, okay, the Eagles, Dallas, I think it's the Eagles, Dallas, red zone defenses. The Eagles, Dallas, Tennessee. The Jaguars are actually down a little bit. Here, I have it right on this card. The Eagles, the Jags, the Dallas, Dallas, Atlanta. Yeah. Okay, there's a team actually going against the 4 best red zone defenses in the coming weeks. And twice Philly was in the top 4 with Dallas and Tennessee. And they're also, the other 3 weeks are going against 3 really bad defenses, like Atlanta. Atlanta, Tampa Bay, and Houston. But they're not terrible defenses. They're middle of the road defenses that aren't so great against So that's my combination. You have a a quarterback going against, and the New York Giants are actually really high in red zone defenses. They're in the top 4. So you have a kicker who is going against um, Dallas, Philadelphia, the Giants, and Tennessee, which are basically in the top 4. They are the top 4 defenses, the red zone defenses, which means this team is going to kick a lot of field goals. And then they're going against the Jaguars. They're going against Philly twice. And they're going against the Jaguars, who are in the top 10. And then they go against Atlanta, Tampa Bay, and Houston, which are middle of the road. Even Tampa's awful defense, their defense actually isn't so bad. It's actually ranked 21, I think, out of 32. So this is the perfect scenario. We have a kicker going against strong red zone defenses and middle of the road defenses. And we have a kicker who's on a team, and he's a good kicker, and he's on a team that has a good offense and a good balanced offense, and he's on a team that has a really good defense. And that team is the Washington Redskins, and the kicker is Dustin Hopkins, who has been putting up double-digit points almost every week. And he's a huge steal, and a lot of people don't have him on their team. And if he's available on your waiver wire, it is the perfect storm scenario the next 7 games. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I just picked him up last week because I was like, oh my God, this guy, it's on, Alex Smith can't get into the end zone. Their wide receiver core is awful in the red zone. They have a good balanced attack with Adrian Peterson. They actually have a really good offense. They have a terrific defense. And they're going against the top 4 in red zone defenses. And the Jags are ranked number 9 or 10. So top, 5 teams. And then the other teams are middle of the road defenses. It's the perfect scenario. And this guy could easily put up double-digit points over the next over the next 7 or 8 weeks. So if he's available, Dustin Hopkins, definitely pick him up. So anyway, this is the Curry and Ice show. Ice will be with us next week for Waiver Wire 10. This is Fantasy Football RSVP, the channel. That's our channel. We also have a podcast under Fantasy Football RSVP Curry and Ice show, Dean Curry and Ice show, but I go by Curry. My buddy goes by Ice. We also have a Facebook page, Fantasy Football RSVP, and some of these things we just kind of got going, so we want to make sure we develop them, and there's a forum for people to talk about their leagues and questions and stuff like that. So we hope you keep tuning in. Have a terrific week 9 in fantasy football. This is Curry, and I'll speak for Ice. Ice signing off. Fantasy Football RSVP. Have a terrific day.